Hey YouTube, what's going on? This is Delusional Bode Lacanian. I am doing another reading of Vivek Chibber's The Class Matrix as part of a series of readings for me to improve my vocabulary and just to kind of understand Vivek's perspective on life, on organization versus Zizek's, which they seem to share a lot of the same values and the same ideas for organization. Perhaps just different approaches to motivate workers. But anyways, reading chapter 3.6, The Place of Ideology. It remains to ask what, if any, role there is for ideology in the framework I have developed. I have argued that capitalism's durability stems fundamentally from the material pressures exerted on social actors by its class structure. This is quite a stark contrast to the culturalist framework developed in the postwar decades, in which ideology was elevated to a primary role. But while I maintain that the culturalists endowed ideology with an unduly inflated role, I do not mean to argue for its irrelevance. On the contrary, ideology has to figure out in any materialist account of capitalism. But as I argue in the following, its location is very different from the one assigned to it by culturalists. Whereas in the latter framework, ideology serves as a cause of the structure's stabilization. In my argument, it is a consequence of that stabilization. I have argued that the source of workers' consent to capitalism, to the extent that it occurs, is not ideology, but the pressure of their circumstances. The choices that are, in fact, available to them by virtue of their structural location and the power relations in which they are embedded. Now, this does not mean ideology is irrelevant to the process of capitalist stabilization. It means only that it cannot be what motivates workers to accept their position in the structure. The motivation comes from the material interests. However, ideology still plays an important and identifiable role as a means of rationalization. For both capitalists and workers, the individuals embedded in those locations have to create cultural and normative codes that enable them to subjectively apprehend their decisions. They have to generate rationalizations for why they accept the rules of the game. Goran Thurburn has suggested that a primary function of ideology is to ensure that class actors are endowed with a subjectivity that enables them to qualify for their given roles in the structure so that they are capable of carrying them out. Hence, ideology provides them with the subjective resources to carry out strategies imposed on them by the structures. Now, for any such theory, there is one fundamental constraint that it must be observed. If, in a materialist theory, ideology is a means for actors to rationalize their location, it is bound by the same condition I imposed on the culturalist theory. It has to respect the basic cognitive abilities of the actors. The rationalization cannot therefore be a hallucination. The ideology must be reinforced and sanctified by the basic facts of the actor's condition, for if the ideology denied them, we must expect that it would lose its attractiveness to the actors themselves. It cannot, therefore, serve as a kind of false consciousness, a veil that altogether obscures the actual functioning of social structures. But rationalizations by their nature are not outright falsehoods. They are ways we learn to live with the facts, not a blanket denial of the facts. Hence, to construe ideology as a kind of rationalization imposes a very different analytical burden on a theory that if we supposed ideology was simply false consciousness. In the case of the working class, we have already seen that they accept capitalist rules of the game not because they view them as legitimate or desirable, but because they see no other choice. It is a small step to predict that workers' ideological reaction will be to naturalize the class structure. They will rationalize the pressures imposed on them as basic facts of life, much like the laws of nature, something that is unpleasant and odious but cannot be changed. This does not mean they see the system as a force standing apart from human action. After all, they encounter it through the lived experience of the workplace and the legally sanctioned authority of the manager-owner. The stamp of human institutions is visible in every dimension of private property. But the remorseless burden of economic pressures, the enormous disparity in power between them and their employer, and the prohibitive costs of collective action, all these factors combine to give the structures an appearance of immutability. While the naturalization of the class structure is common among workers, it also finds an echo among employers. They are, after all, highly constrained by their location, much the same as their employees. Hence, much as with workers, we should expect capitalists to take their roles as being expressions of deep, unchanging facts of human society, no more subject to manipulation than biological facts. The difference between them will be that, in addition to seeing the rules of capitalism as natural laws, capitalists will also be far more likely to view them as legitimate and desirable. A materialist class theory predicts that winners in a social system will apprehend their constraints as not merely binding but beneficial, and they will project the narrow gains that accrue to them as social gains. This is not just true of capitalism and any social system. The dominant group should be expected to not only generate a legitimizing ideology, but also internalize it more fully than any other. Hence, perhaps ironically, the class that actively consents to capitalism is not the working class, but the class that rules over it. The problem with cultural theory is not that it highlights the importance of consent, but that it seeks it out in the wrong class. Whereas workers will tend to view the system as unchanging and unfair, capitalists will endorse it as a natural expression of human nature and also desirable. This is how rationalization takes divergent forms between the two classes and reflects the difference in their constraints and their fortunes. In neither instance is it simply false consciousness. In neither instance it is simply false consciousness. In both cases, the actors' rationalizations reflect their actual situation to a considerable extent. So too, the content varies in accordance to the experience of each party. Whereas for workers, we should expect their naturalizing reaction to be expressed in cynicism about the system. It is being corrupt and so on, and so on. And in a general tendency to be very pessimistic about social change. Among capitalists, we should expect a tendency not just to naturalize capitalism, but to celebrate its proximity to human nature, to see their own success as proof of its fairness, to warn against changing anything that so directly expresses deep human drives, and so forth. Ideology thus occupies an important place in a materialist class theory, but it operates as an effect of actors' class strategies, not as a cause. In this capacity, it conforms to Marx's general dictum that it is agents' social being that determines their consciousness and not their consciousness that determines their being. In this capacity, it conforms to Marx's general dictum that it's agents' social being that determines their consciousness and not their consciousness that determines their being. Yeah, I gotta be honest, I'm trying to improve my vocabulary, and this is helping a lot. I've been trying to explain to anyone able to listen to me. I've been having a bit of an experience where the language center in my brain has just been kind of transforming, just having to be exposed to sort of critical theory material, and it's great stuff to learn, but it really does kind of spin my head a bit because I have to switch back and forth between programming and this. And my next phase is I'm going to try to start reading in Spanish and see what that does to the language center in my head. So, but this is a great book to be reading to help me through this process, because this is something I feel like I'll be looking at in the future. Even like years down the road, I feel like I'll always still be learning something new from this material from Vivek, a guy, an academic. He's the founded the Catalyst publication, so it's kind of respecting him a lot more these days. So, but anyways, thanks YouTube for listening.